Good evening, everyone, and welcome to one of our last Partners for Democracy discussions. My name is Sterling Higa, and I'm an advocate from Oahu. I serve as Executive Director of Housing Hawaii's Future, a local nonprofit dedicated to ending our state's affordable and workforce housing shortage. I joined this program because no one person has the knowledge and skills necessary to lead our state into the future. We need a strong network of committed and capable leaders. When you look out into this room, you see that group, those leaders, and I am excited to build with you all. I'm honored to introduce our distinguished guest speaker this evening. He comes from a long line of famous civil servants, including President John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Senator Ted Kennedy, who dedicated their lives to making a difference for our nation. Joe Kennedy has dedicated his career to social and economic justice. A former congressman, legal aid volunteer, and assistant district attorney, he founded Groundwork Project to address pervasive disparities in the American justice political system and to help build power in historically excluded communities. In addition to Groundwork Project, Joe is a senior advisor to the Emerson Collective, the Poor People's Campaign, and National Association of Community Health Centers. He also serves on the board of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, the Woodnell Climate Research Center, and the Massachusetts Association for Mental Health. Tonight, he'll share with us his work in advocacy and civic engagement, and the important work he's doing with the Groundwork Project. Let's welcome and send our aloha to Mr. Joe Kennedy III.
I will take all the aloha you guys can give. That is for damn sure. So I am coming to you from my attic. I've got two little kids hopefully sleeping below me. If they wake up, I'm going to be in deep trouble. You might meet them, which won't be great because it's a little after 11 o'clock here. And I just got an alert on my cell phone saying there's going to be a dense fog advisory tomorrow morning at 35 degrees. So if any of you are jealous of where I am sitting at the moment, turn around and hopefully that will be gone in a heartbeat. But I am so thrilled to be able to join you all. I wish it was in person, in case you couldn't tell, but so thrilled to be able to join you all tonight. And really look forward to turning this into much more of a conversation and a discussion than me speaking at a computer screen, having that beamed 7,000 miles away. So let's get to that as quickly as we can. I thought, though, that given what I know a bit of the information that Kyle had passed over to me about all of you and about your mission and what brings you all together, and a deep love for Hawaii, a commitment to public service, and a dedication to trying to learn about how you can use your dedication and passion and skills and community, the relationships that you have and are forging with others, to try to address some of the pervasive and persistent needs across an extraordinarily vibrant, rich community, but one like every that has challenges, and some unique to Hawaii, some not. Excuse me. And so I thought I'd share a little bit about some lessons that I had learned, some the hard way, I guess, through nearly a decade in Congress and campaigns all over the country, campaigning for other colleagues and for members up and down, candidates up and down the ticket. And then the work that observations and lessons learned that drew me to found the Groundwork Project, and why we've chosen to focus where we have, and where I think there might be some either opportunities for collaboration, but some lessons learned that might apply to some of the work that you all are seeking to engage in, whether that happens to be issues around affordable housing, or environmentalism, energy and renewable energy, green technologies, and others. So let's jump right in, and then I'll drone on here for a couple minutes, and then let's turn it into a conversation, if that sounds good. So I spent nearly a decade in Congress, and as I said, campaigning much of that time all over the country. I came into office in the 2012 election, so took office in 2013 when the Democrats were in the minority of the House of Representatives. And if you spend much time in the minority of the House of Representatives, you realize that you don't want to spend any more time in the minority in the House of Representatives. So the best thing you can do then is to go try to win back that majority. So I spent an awful lot of time and effort campaigning around the country for those so-called swing seats, the races that if we were going to be able to win or the races we were going to defend, those folks that would make us a majority. And that oftentimes ended up being more moderate or conservative districts. It was very gerrymandered, as it is still to this day. But trying to find ways to craft a message that would be able to lure either infrequent voters or more moderate or conservative voters to come out and vote for a Democrat. And what you realize in doing those campaigns over and over and over again is that sometimes really good candidates don't win. Sometimes less good candidates do. Sometimes as a candidate, there's only so much you can control, but you are often subject to forces well beyond your control or what you can influence. But a big portion of how people win and lose has actually very little to do with the talent of the candidate or even often what their campaign, the strength of their campaign, but it happens to do with the infrastructure and architecture underneath those candidates. And we've seen that really come to the fore over the course of the past several years. Democrats traditionally, up until recently, would often get outraised by Republicans. We would often point the finger and say, hey, Republicans have all this big dark money that's coming in to flood the elections and help boost their candidates. And they still do, and a lot of that actually isn't even reported. But of late, Democrats have actually been outraising Republicans. The challenge is that not all dollars are equal. And so you have some extraordinary candidates. Beto O'Rourke, for instance, in his race against Senator Ted Cruz a couple of years ago, where he raised over $80 million, but half of that money came in the last 6 weeks of a race. An extraordinary candidate, Sarah Gideon, who was the Speaker of the House in Maine, who unfortunately came up short in a race against Susan Collins back in 2020, lost by about 10 points and finished a campaign with $15 million in the bank, largely because Mitch McConnell decided to confirm Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, and Susan Collins was going to be a swing vote. And so Democrats across the country went and sent Sarah Gideon $5, $10, $15, $25, and she had this enormous influx of funds, but with very little time to actually be able to deploy it or deploy it at all strategically. And so what we've seen is a dramatic mismatch in how campaigns are actually structured and the investment in the long-term infrastructure building that is needed and necessary in order to win in places that Democrats often don't. And the reason why that becomes such a big problem is if you are consistently focused on winning that next race, as I was for years, you're not actually going to spend more time focusing on the places like Alabama or Mississippi or West Virginia, where you say, hey, there's not a competitive race here. So we shouldn't spend the time here. We'll allocate our time and effort, energy, and resources elsewhere. The other flip side on that is it means that a national Democratic Party doesn't invest in reliably blue states either. How often do you all see big name Democratic candidates coming out to Hawaii and campaign or dedicate their focus to an issue that is affecting community members in Hawaii? We don't, because at a certain level, we'll say, well, it's a reliably blue state. We don't need to spend those dollars in Hawaii. We can spend those dollars elsewhere. We can campaign elsewhere. We have to do that. Well, the challenge then is that that same level of commitment and dedication of resources actually affects blue states sometimes in blue communities the same way it'll affect conservative or communities that we often overlook. And so what we've done at the Groundwork Project is trying to actually address that lack of long-term sustained investment. And this comes from, I'll tell you the reasons how we believe aspirationally this can be effective, and why we know, I think, that it can be effective, because we've seen it done right. Unfortunately, those that did it right are on the other side of the aisle. It's the folks that did it right were largely led by the Koch brothers and a conservative conservative movement led by those individuals and a cohort of supporters that not only took their resources, financial and otherwise, and invested in candidates that were running for office or the traditional campaign committees or the races that were up for grabs today, but created an entire parallel infrastructure that invested in school boards, in creating state legislative committees, in creating state incubators for state level policy, that created Libre, a conservative institution focused on the synergies between Catholicism, conservative values, and Hispanic culture, all in Spanish, and not overly political, but just knowing that if they continued that sustained investment over time, you would be able to build up the infrastructure, reach out to community leaders and individuals that had credibility and integrity in community and help pull them into a network. And for those that wonder whether that was going to be successful, we point out that in 1993, Republicans had uniform control of three state houses and governorships. 3. Today, they've got unified control over 26. You will often hear then people in Massachusetts say, well, that stinks to be in those conservative states, but in a progressive state like ours, we're able to withstand that time. Sort of. But I point out that the threats that we see that we are now under from the undermining of the Voting Rights Act, that came from a case Shelby v. Holder out of Shelby County, Alabama. The fact that Democrats have unified control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, unified control of the branches of government in Washington, and are still at danger of losing Roe v. Wade or having it overturned while we have that control. Why? Because of a ultra-conservative state legislature out of Mississippi that passed a law that deliberately contradicted federal precedent, but knew that it was being appealed to a conservative appellate court and a conservative Supreme Court, and that they then will be able to either overturn their case in whole or in part. But even if they do it in part, they can come back and get another bite at the apple. And so when you look at it that way, they have that path to an end run around the federal policymaking process between 26 state legislatures and governorships, a conservative bench, and a conservative Supreme Court, and they've got that for decades to come. So the question for us is, what are we going to do about it, both from a local level and a national level? And I think the answer to that actually is quite clear. It's invest in local community organizers, invest in that infrastructure. Because when I would always say in my campaigns, my commitment as a candidate would be to knock on more doors and shake more hands and have more meats on a stick at a county fair than anybody. But I wasn't, my speech in your living room wasn't going to be what ultimately was going to win me an election or not. It was going to be what my supporters said at the sideline of their kids' soccer games or in line at Dunkin' Donuts here in Boston. It was going to be whether that independent validator was going to be willing to spend their time and effort and energy for me. And finding those folks that have those connections, that glue, that integrity in a community, and investing in them in a way that is apolitical, at least at first, to recognize that they know the issues that are affecting their community members, and they can pull people in about those issues. And then as you are able to organize around those issues, that can bleed into and then extend into issues around broader issues of policy and politics. But it's finding and investing in those individuals that is going to, 1, flex those muscles of political activism, 2, energize a community to try to actually increase their connectivity and bring them together, and 3, restore people's trust in a political and electoral process so that people actually believe that they have an ownership stake in the outcome. And that is one of the biggest challenges we face, is an increasingly cynical public that says, win or lose, things don't change. It doesn't matter what happens. I don't have a stake in this because they don't listen to me anyway, and I'm out. And when you withdraw, other forces that want to withdraw win. And make no mistake, that is a deliberate strategy. So at Groundwork, we believe that focusing on identifying those key community partners and investing in them, supporting them however it is that they need and however it is that we can, is going to be the way in which we help try to rebuild that connectivity within our communities. And that can ripple out. What does that mean for communities in Hawaii? Look, I wish I could say I knew what it was like to campaign across Hawaii. I actually spent some time there when I was younger for a summer or so, and get back as often as I possibly can. But without question, you've got challenges from being separated by islands and perhaps smaller population size, but you have a unique identity, as you know better than anybody, of being from Hawaii, and a unique concern for the people of Hawaii and the unique opportunities that come with it. And being able to channel that dedication and passion that you all have for those local community, the challenges that you see in your community and the members that can help bring people together. I can think of no better place to actually help hold together that type of unity and that type of energy and activism than what you all can do across the state. And so I'd love to learn a little bit more about what you guys are thinking of as you move through this incredible program and what that future might hold for you. I hope that you will all stay active and engaged in our communities. I imagine, and I think I've seen that a number of you are thinking of running for office one day. Happy to get into that. I'll tell you at the moment you're crazy, but nevertheless, if you want to do it, we'll chat. But the last thing I want to leave you with is I fervently believe that the way that we elect not just a more progressive and representative political leaders in our country, but the way in which we restore trust in a democracy is actually by making sure that we engage our community and respond in a way in which we actually haven't been doing for a very long time. And there's nobody better suited to do that across Hawaii than all of you. So that's plenty from me tonight to start. I'm grateful for the opportunity and look forward to engaging in discussion with everybody. It looks like you're clapping, but I can't hear anything. And thank you.
Raise your hand and then I can call upon you guys if you have any questions. Dane,
I have to speak up.
can you hear okay, Joe? Yeah.
Thank you, Joel, for your time. So as you campaigned across the states in gerrymandered districts, swing districts, I mean, any takeaways that you could suggest to our group on maybe strategies or tips that could help that you've learned that convinced it to go your way?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, gerrymandering stinks. Two, what's really critical in those races is that you have candidates that are from a community, right? And what I saw in the 2018 election cycle when we won the House back after Donald Trump's election in 2016 was when you actually talked about values, Democrats could win, right? When you talked about policies, it got more complicated. But when you talked about healthcare as a commitment that we make to each other to be there at your time of deepest need, and that in the richest, most powerful nation in the world, people shouldn't have to be rationing insulin, very few people will disagree with that. When you start getting into the finer points of, are we going to talk about a public option or Medicare for all, and what's included and what's not, and what kind of what services are included, which ones are optional, how are we going to pay for it, the rest of it. There's legitimate debate about all of those various pieces of policy, of course there is. But when you could frame it as a value, particularly in contrast to Trump care or the effort to repeal and replace an Affordable Care Act with nothing, that all of a sudden we can talk about. When you talk about, frame it as we believe that humans are causing climate change and that we can do something about it, versus those that don't believe in climate change, and believe that the world is somehow going to right itself or that this is a made up science, that is also a value. And so when you frame those issues on values and you allow a local candidate to frame the policy response as he or she needs in order to be able to speak to their district, you have an awful lot better shot of being successful in that district, because it's not then somebody from Boston, Massachusetts saying, hey, I know, I've studied this, I know what the right answer is. Here in Oklahoma, this is what you should do because I studied it and I know what's best for you. That is a surefire way to lose election. Democrats do that all the time, talk down to folks, and we consistently lose. One of these days, we're going to learn not to do that. Ask questions. I think it was Dan. Listen, I always found that in most of the school groups or whatnot that I would speak to, I had noticed after, when I got elected, I was in my early 30s. So they were like, hey, you're young, go talk to school kids, right? I was like, okay, well, like I'm 15 years older than many of them, but like, sure. But they would always get talked to and say, you should care about this, or you should care about that, or you're the future of America. And I'm like, okay, you're like an 18-year-old freshman. I came up here because there's free pizza and I have to listen to a politician. I didn't care about that. But no one ever asked them what they cared about. And if you actually turn around and say, hey, why are you here? And for some of you, it might be free pizza. Some of you, like you're a college kid, you're, trying to get a date with somebody, or like you wandered in the wrong room, like whatever it is. But now that you're here, like, what is it that you care about? And how are you thinking about it? And how can we respond to it? And I'll tell you, over the years, healthcare, gun violence, these used to be some of the top issues. Then it turned into climate change. And then it was climate justice, right? And then it was environmental justice. And the justice piece, that justice part wasn't there in 2014, 2016. It was a big deal by 2020. And ask questions, listen. So I think providing people the ability to be flexible about how they apply those values to their district, having candidates that are willing to listen. And the last piece, Dan, is exactly what I was referring to in Groundwork. Jamie Harrison is a spectacular candidate for office. Beto O'Rourke is too. South Carolina didn't have a robust architecture and infrastructure set up to enable somebody to win against a seasoned Republican incumbent with essentially unlimited financing as well. Right? You're not going to find a more talented candidate than Jamie Harrison. The system just wasn't set up, and it drives me crazy about this because you have a bunch of supposedly successful financiers on the Democratic side that say, hey, we love Jamie Harrison or Joe Kennedy or Beto O'Rourke or Sarah Gideon or somebody else. Here's a $5,000 check. You would never actually run a business that way. You would never fund a CEO to say, hey, I spent 15 minutes with him and he seems like a charismatic, likable guy. I'll go fund your business. You sit there and get a business plan. You say, okay, well, how are you going to respond to X, Y, and Z? Or is there something underneath here that actually is going to make it work? And we never invest in that. And so trying to convince a democratic architecture here, an infrastructure or apparatus here to say, hey, you want to win in these states, you better invest in these states. And you're going to have to, we need to do that, one, because it affects us all through the courts, as I discussed. But two, if we really want to believe in that rising coalition, that demographics is going to help lead destiny, the blackest state in the country has hardly any Democrats elected at the federal level at all. Mississippi, 40% black. One Democrat elected at the federal level, 0 statewide. So I don't know who's thinking that demographics is all of a sudden going to lead to a whole bunch of Democrats getting elected. Republicans are pretty good at making sure that doesn't happen. You got to work at this. That's a very long answer to a very short question. Sorry.
That was very pointed. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Vicky?
Thank you for speaking to us. And my question is, here in Hawaii, a lot of the races, the majority of them are, it's not really Republican against Democrat, it's the primary that's the most important. So how do you recommend going through primary against fellow Democrats without deteriorating the trust within the Democratic Party as a whole?
Great question. As somebody that got into a Democratic primary and lost, I'm not sure I'm the best one to tell you how to do that. But so here's the thing on it, and as honest as I can be about it. One, I certainly don't think anymore that primaries are a bad thing. I don't think you should jump into a primary just for the sake of a primary. I think if you have an alternative vision or reason why somebody should be challenged, I would encourage, I don't believe that any sort of elected office should be something where somebody wins once and then all of a sudden you've basically got the seat for life. These jobs are hard. If you want to keep serving, keep winning. But the goal, one of the big challenges I do believe we have with our system at the moment is after you win once, you can an incumbent can increase the barrier of entry so high that it makes it next to impossible for them to really be challenged. And that's where folks just get comfortable. I think there's enough urgency in this moment for all of us across our country that those folks in leadership positions shouldn't be comfortable because there's too much need across our communities to say, hey, those folks there, you don't have to work weekends. I'm sorry, this is the job. You got to work weekends. And if it means that you serve in office for 7 years instead of 15, fine. Thank you for your service, grateful for it. But, people don't play in the NFL for 50 years. other than Tom Brady apparently, right? But like, you don't, like, it's hard. It's exhausting. That's okay. This isn't supposed to be about the longevity of the candidate or the incumbent. It's supposed to be about the service that is provided to a constituency. And so run, get on in, have a reason to do it because you're going to be pushed on it. But then here's the other thing, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. In all honesty, one of the biggest surprises of my race was just how vitriolic and bombastic it got. And, you know, I was used to getting threats and stuff online from the right, from Trump supporters and such, and it didn't happen all that often, but it happened. I was stunned to see the level of discourse and bullying that came in from the left. Stunned. And essentially as an attempt to target myself, my family, my supporters, my volunteers, to bully them out of supporting me in my race. And I never expected that. And one of the challenges that we wrestled with was that it actually was pretty effective because people step back. And so I do think that there's a challenge, a question there for folks on the left to say, hey, how can we make sure that we channel a positive energy to a primary to say, hey, this isn't personal. This is about difference of opinion or difference of definition of the job or how we conceive the job should be done or should be run or should be executed. And we are going to run with everything we've got to be able to push a candidate to stand on your values and your service and your record and be able to articulate that. But when this turns into threatening volunteers of an opponent's campaign to get them to back off, that's something that we as a society and as a Democratic Party should also call out, because that's not the type of politics, at least it's not the politics that I believed in. And my concern is that the challenge is that it is effective. And so if you're going to jump into that primary, be ready for a level of discourse that you perhaps wouldn't expect, because at this point it is to some extent sadly sanctioned. And there's very little recourse for folks that engage in it. So I say that just as not as a warning, but just as for those of you that are thinking of jumping into it, make sure you got a thick skin and are ready for it, because at least for me, I was surprised by it, and you know, candidly, we weren't expecting it.
Okay. How about we state our name, whether we're an advocate or a candidate, and the island you're from. So anyone else have questions? Okay.
Hello, thanks for being here. My name is John Pele. I'm from the island of Molokai, and I am a candidate. So see if I can phrase this correctly. Maybe you could give me some insight as the specific government body that might be affected that we're trying to change, or I'm trying to change. In specificity, it might be more effective if multiple seats were taken. So can you share some insights on sharing platforms with the same ideals versus the advantage of being an individual to try to create change for that particular seat? Even though it would be really effective to have multiple seats in that government body, that governing body, that align with those values to make a real change. Is there a difference in how you would approach your ideals, or would you stick to being more of an individualist so you could get your point across? Or would people just say they're on to you?
So
I don't know if I framed that correctly.
No, I think I understand what you're getting at. And I think, like in any campaign, there's a balance, right? And you see this oftentimes play out in a primary versus a general. In the primary, you're distinguishing yourself from your fellow members of the same party, for me, fellow Democrats. And then in a general, you're largely distinguishing between a brand of a Democratic Party or Republican Party, or what Democratic leadership will do in the House of Representatives in government versus Republicans. Paul Ryan budget, Donald Trump foreign policy, Donald Trump healthcare bill versus the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, right? And so that by definition ends up being much more of a, again, kind of a value, bigger picture slate, if you will, because you're running as a Democrat, rather than the distinctions between and amongst Democrats in a field. What I would say is candidates, obviously, there's some that can be successful with both, right? I think it largely depends on the level of coordination that you're going to have with other candidates, right? And the districts that you're going to run in, the communities that you're going to run in. And so I think it's very much a case by case basis. If you all line up on, oftentimes Democratic candidates in a Democratic primary, myself and even Senator Markey, the current U.S. Senator who I challenged, we actually agreed on probably 95% of the policies, right? And so there wasn't a huge difference between us on those. There was a difference I would articulate between how I actually define the job and the role of being a United States Senator. Candidly, not a whole lot of other people bought that distinction, right? So we didn't do a good enough job, and a whole bunch of other factors of selling people on that difference. Without question, a party of one in office and government isn't going to be able to govern very effectively. You need a coalition because you need to be able to have a majority to deliver on those values and the policies that you articulate. And so I would tell you that, working on a really clear communication strategy to make sure that if you're running as part of a group or a slate, if you will, across, say, a series of state representatives or city councilors or whatever else, where you can say, hey, we share these values, and if we are successful, this is the type of work we want to implement for our community, while then also not saying, hey, we are being controlled by, we are all just the same and in lockstep, and what you're getting is, you're not getting an actual individual thinker, you're getting, back to old party politics and board bosses, right? But you can effectively manage through that, either through the course of debates or your local communications, what events you show up to and how you articulate responses, while also saying, hey, on these issues, we are going to be aligned. And sometimes, you can issue those press releases together, you can issue them jointly, separately, but linked to others. I think, given the local realities that you are confronting, there's a whole series of tools and tactics that you can put forward to be able to show that coordination without necessarily having to own the pitfalls, challenges, or mistakes that another candidate is going to make.
Right. Anyone else? Question? Interesting.
So I was trying to resist. Hello, Joe. Addison, running for county council on the island of Kauai. You talked about the investing into infrastructure at the ground roots level. I mean, when we look at on our islands, what would you recommend for our community? What investments we should be looking at into our infrastructure in our community to make sure we don't take for granted how blue we are, and that's something that you were just mentioning, that we just don't want to lose the momentum here in Hawaii.
So it's a great question, and there's a lot of research on this, and happy to we can follow up afterwards. Happy to point you to some of the folks that are doing really good work here. So some of you might be familiar with some of the infrastructure kind of pieces to this. One aspect are called voter tables and donor tables and C3 tables or C4 tables. So the table idea is you get a donor table, for instance, is you get a association of political donors that can get together and together strategize about where their funds are going to be allocated so that there's some strategic outline and design and strategy behind those donations. So it's not just one-offs. It's not just somebody saying, hey, I want to support voter registration drives, or I want to support turnout drives, or I want to support, this issue on affordable housing and a ballot initiative or X, Y, or Z, but there's some strategy behind it saying, hey, that's great. We need to fund, we need X number more signatures. We want to fund Y number. We need to get Y number of people registered. That's going to cost $150,000. Let's go find the funding to do that. Now that we've got that, let's allocate the next money, next pot of resources to mobilizing turnout, or to a communication strategy, or to funding a Democratic Party, or an issue campaign around Medicaid expansion, whatever those issues are, right? So you can have a donor table that actually helps bring the donors together to be able to allocate those resources. You have a C3 table that is able to then have a strategy of, similarly, of organizations that then can execute on a series of C3, so non-politically oriented activities. Voter registration is obviously a great one that oftentimes is used by C3s, right? And obviously those donations can be tax deductible. And there's a wide variety of examples of this, but voter education initiatives, voter registration initiatives, as I said, voter mobilization, some aspects of mobilization, right? Various pieces of this that can be done from C3. Then there's a C4 table, right? That can actually engage in that political activity. And some of those funds, they can be reported, sometimes they're not reported, but they're much more overtly political. And so you can get donors behind saying, hey, how are we going to focus on a C3 side? Maybe we do issues around climate change. On a C4 side, we're going to focus on trying to push turnout on an environmental justice issue for X, Y, or Z candidate or slates or candidates, or fund a campaign that ends up being anti, the other side. And if you have a robust series of that infrastructure between a donor alliance, a voter table, or a donor alliance, a C3 table, and a C4 table, that is ensuring that those institutions, local institutions, have the adequate funding, and are well-led, and are well-resourced, you're gonna get that political activity. You're gonna get the community exercising muscles ready to go. And the best part about that is that's when it's done right, it's year-round, and it doesn't fall off after an election. You just depend on this as a campaign. If you could depend on campaigns to do it, you run 1,000,000 miles an hour from October to November, you end on the Wednesday after election day, and then it sits idle for the next, year to 18 months, and then it picks back up again. But it means you only come around in a time of election, which nobody likes. It means that those volunteers that were signed up all dissipate. It means that those staff members that had a job don't. Whereas if you're doing this year round, you all of a sudden are able to keep that staff on board. It means they're engaging in a continual conversation with members of a community, not just when an election happens. Yeah. It means the trust and the relationships that an organization has with their community members grows, isn't frayed. And it means your ability to hold an elected official accountable goes way up. Because if that elected official isn't also in consistent conversation with you, the local community is going to know it, and the leaders are going to know it. And there will be somebody else who is, and that's where you get your primary challenge. And so you have that continued engagement that isn't just, oh, hey, it's 3 months before it's September. I got an election in November. I didn't really have a primary because we don't have primaries anymore, and there's no Republican Party in the state. So I guess I'll show up to a couple of town halls and do something. That is a terrible way, one, to run a campaign. It's a terrible way to get your community served. And you just create a disconnect between the elected official and the community. And if you have these other entities kind of vibrant and engaged and resourced and funded, and again, I can't tell you what organizations or institutions to fund or who those individual leaders are that are doing it, but some of the work that we're doing at Groundwork, we spend a lot of time doing the research and outreach and just meetings and listening to identify who are the key leaders in some of these communities. We're doing a lot of work in Alabama and Mississippi. The first organization we funded in Mississippi was in Huntsville. In Alabama was in Huntsville. If you're going to win, Democrats going to win statewide in Alabama, you're going to have to win Huntsville. We funded an organization there, run by an incredibly dynamic Black woman that is organizing a community, not around Democratic politics. Running as a Democrat in Alabama is a surefire way to lose an election. But she's organizing a community around issues around mental health and policing, right? And not necessarily a defund the police mechanism, but police accountability and police resources. And so and she's a dynamo. but she's got people coming in and out and she knows everybody. And if we can help fund her organization so that she can actually hire 2 or 3 more people and keep them, we make a commitment, but we make that commitment for 3 years so that we can tell them, you can go invest in that staff person and you can keep that staff person on for the next 3 years and know that they don't have to get laid off. That's a game changer for them. And that's what we need to do, right? Because you have to keep that year-round conversation going. And again, how do I know that? Because that's what Koch brothers did. And it worked.
Danicole? Thanks for being here. My name is Danicole from the island of Oahu, and I'm an advocate here. I think talking about your model, I'm really fascinated by it. But I think one of the things that the 2020 election made me realize is I think misinformation is the biggest threat to our democracy. I think how the COVID pandemic was talked about, especially with vaccine mandates, and even though Hawaii is a blue state, I live in like North Shore Kahukulea, which is kind of conservative, so I kind of know kind of the dynamic over there. But also the issue of January 6th. So I think it's the biggest threat. And as you talk about your model about outreach and meeting people where you're at, how do you get ahead of misinformation? Because I think that's just going to continue to be worse. And I think those areas where you are trying to, those swing districts or those red states that I think your organization is trying to get a hold of to move us in a more progressive direction, if we don't get a hold of that, it will just continue to permeate and I think put our democracy at greater threat, expand gerrymandering, and also I think create a national security crisis in our country. So I want to know how you see your model getting ahead of that, I think, challenge in the future.
It's a great question, and thanks for asking. I see it as the way to get ahead of that. Because, and what's your name, sir?
Danicole.
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 Danicole?
Danicole. 2 names in one. Dan and Nicole. Danicole.
Ah, Danicole. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's complicated at first. When I say the 2 names, people get it.
Yeah, exactly. That helped. So I think what you're getting at is, so one, it's a huge issue. It's one of the biggest threats to our democracy, and no one has a great answer for it, right? But the way that I come at that is I can be objectively right and objectively truthful, and there's nothing I can say or do that is going to change the minds of somebody conservative in your community from some Howley from Boston, right? Like, no chance, right? No chance. What might, not to say it is, but what might is when it's coming from the next door neighbor, right? Because I'm not talking to you as a member of Congress or, a fellow American or as your elected official or anything else. I'm talking to you as the guy that lives next door, and like our kids breathe the same air and go to the same school and like play in the same playground, and we share this community together. And you know me, not by a political orientation or a label or a job title or anything else, but you know me as a neighbor. You know me as a community member. You know me as your little league coach. You know me as, the guy that takes your kids fishing or whatever else it is. And so with that semblance of community, there comes, not always and not with everybody, but there comes a level of connection, connectivity, and trust. It's a reason why there's massive distrust of everything big at the moment, from big economy, big government, big media, national media, terrible. People still trust local media, right? People don't trust, they hate Congress, they like their congressman, right? It would drive me nuts. I'd be campaigning around and be like, hey, you realize Republicans want to privatize Medicare, right? Well, not my congressman. Like, yeah, he did. He voted that way. Your data must be wrong. He would never do that to me. Like, dude, he voted for it. Here's the vote. They still don't believe it. It's like, I know that guy. That's not, he wouldn't do that. And so that's where I say the best, the kind of first order defense against that level of misinformation is, in fact, trusted communicators in a community that is able to actually confront it, where when it comes in from, and you're not gonna, nothing's gonna be wholly foolproof here, right? When something comes in from Fox News or Breitbart or InfoWars or wherever else, if you have somebody that you trust that's able to say, man, you're full of crap. That's not the way that goes. That's not the way it works. That's going to be the best hope we got. We're living in a time with a backlash against expertise, right? Where like people are saying, oh, you're a doctor, you don't know, like you don't know this. I'm going to go take a horse parasite to try to cure COVID. Like, okay, go nuts. I don't know what to tell you. So you're not going to solve every problem here, but I do know that if you have that coming from some level of a trusted communicator, that's going to be your best bet. And not for nothing, I think part here that the left sometimes misses is that for some of those folks that you pointed to, Donald Trump is the trusted communicator, right? So he can say, hey, I actually think a way to prevent COVID is injecting bleach. It's a good way to kill yourself, right? It's not a good way to stop from a airborne virus. But if they believe in him, they're going to credit what he says. And there's no amount of me trying to discredit him that is going to work because they don't believe in what I'm saying. They discredit me, not him. So my attempts to say he's lying, he's misleading you, it's deliberate misrepresentation, it's just falsehoods and not true. In their eyes, I'm discrediting myself, I'm not discrediting him. And so the best way I know how to do that is to come back with some other trusted messenger, but you have to build that trust up. And that takes time, but you guys, all of us can be that for our own communities.
I think Nikki had a question.
Hi, I'm Nikki. I'm an advocate. So you had mentioned that there was some resources where in the Georgia Mississippi election where.
Okay, I missed that part. Somebody was coughing. I mentioned that there were resources.
Oh, that you mentioned resources for an elected official that was able to gain someone to hire to help with the advocacy within the community and the outreach within the community. Does there exist any sort of list of resources for elected officials to be able to gain access to funding, to be able to keep additional staff to be on ground?
Not that I'm aware of. There's certainly not, so if it's official staff through your official work, whether it's city council or state rep or whatever else, the official side of that would come through municipal funding or state funding. And so, there might be various pockets there that you can check from the public funding resources. On the party side of it, the political side of it, not really. I mean, I was in Alabama recently and with the minority leader, Democratic leader of the House of Representatives, who said, he started a program and a collaboration with the local law school to have law students actually read the bills because many members of the legislature weren't lawyers, so they had no idea, they didn't know what the bills were filed actually said. And there was no resource to actually translate those bills into a one-pager to say, hey, this is what that 500-page bill, this is what it actually says. So he created a program at the law school to do so. Great idea. Law students are better than nothing, but law students aren't lawyers either. They're law students. Right? They've been a lawyer for 6 months, right? They've been studying law for 6 months. Better than nothing, but not the same thing as actually having a team of lawyers funded by a political caucus to actually go through and do a legal analysis as to what's in the bills. And so he was, on top of all of his other responsibilities, trying to raise money to start a think tank to be able to provide those resources so that his members knew what they were voting. But that's the type of stuff that when you don't have these resources in a state, that burden comes down on a minority leader to do that on top of all of his other responsibilities, right? Well, if we had funded these other infrastructure pieces put in place, chances are somebody could turn around and say, hey, we'll fund that, or we now have this developed enough where we have access to the donors to actually fund that. Can be a contribution to law school. That's certainly tax deductible. And by the way, a major foundation, Ford Foundation or something else, they might be interested. Right? That's nothing political about that. That's just saying, hey, can we translate the bills into a one-page policy document? Sure, there's nothing partisan about that. So, but that's where, depending on, when I was in the House, I would go around and raise money, every election cycle, even if I didn't have a particularly strong challenge. But I had campaign staff I wanted to pay because I wanted them to be able to do campaign work in my district, political work, to my benefit, to the benefit of my constituents and our political party. And I'd just go run around the state and the country raising money to do just that. That was on me. So I'm unaware of a list per se, but that's something that some of these efforts together can certainly do. And rather than have each member have to go around and raise $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 to fund one staffer, if you came together and actually made a pitch to some of the folks in Hawaii that actually had the ability to write a $500,000 check, you could fund 15 shared staffers. And that solves, a big problem. Maybe not perfectly, but it's big stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for taking the time to speak to our cohort. My name is Jared Ogdenung, and I come from the island of Maui, and I am on the advocate track.
Where do you live in Maui?
Oh, Kahului, where the
Great.
airport is.
We're coming to visit.
Oh, awesome. Awesome.
Thanks for the invitation.
But again, yeah, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. My question for you is, you mentioned somewhere along the lines that values, when you focus on values, that is often the point where you will win campaigns. But when you start moving towards policy and focusing the conversations around policy, that's where things get a little bit complicated. We know that values inform policy, but I guess my question for you specifically is, what do you do in a situation when there's usually conflicting values within a community? Because that's a very difficult tension to navigate. I'll give you some context. For Maui County, we have let's take our tourism industry, for example. We have one side that says, let's bring all the tourists, let's open the floodgates. And then the other side is, okay, well, we need some control over our visitor industry and proper destination management. Another one could be with respect to economic growth, meaning that we need to open and explore all different opportunities for economic growth in our communities. On the other hand, we have the tension of, well, we want to keep Hawaii and our island styles and values the way it is. So there, and that can apply to many different policy situations. But again, going back to the question, how would you handle or navigate the tension of a community that has conflicting values?
So there's no right answer to that. It's a great question. There's a couple ways to approach it, right? One is the very crass political answer, which is to say, do a poll, figure out which one, 70-30, go down on 70, right? And that's, you need votes and that's how you're gonna win. The other flip side to that is, look, I found on some of the most controversial issues, I actually felt liberated on it because no matter what you did, you pissed off half the people. And there was no way you were going to make everybody happy. There just wasn't, because some people want more development, some people want less. There's no way to, you can try to save that in bit and say, hey, okay, well, more in this spot or under these circumstances or this time of year or with this restrictions, noise, occupancy, no Airbnbs, but this or that or the other thing. Fine, you can get into the nuances of it. And the nuance, actually I have a great appreciation for nuance because that's how you can narrow the areas of conflict, is by helping solve and narrow that scope so you can get more people on board with the solution. So that's fine. But to a certain point, right, when I was in Congress and we had to decide whether we were going to go through with the Iran nuclear deal or not, my district was just furious and highly divided on either side. No matter what I did, I was going to make a whole bunch of my supporters and a bunch of my constituents angry. And some of them never came back. But no matter what you chose, that was going to happen. And so if you kind of sit there and go, okay, well, no matter what I do, they're gonna get upset. I might as well do at least the right thing so that I'm comfortable with the decision, because I don't want to have to be defending a decision I don't believe in or agree with for the rest of my time in Congress, just because I thought I was going to get, it was 48-52 when I was going to do this for, a 4-point margin that wasn't going to matter. That's dumb. So, I think you owe, as an elected official, your constituents the responsibility of doing your homework and understanding what the core issues are, the core areas of disagreement, and whether there's areas to mitigate that area of disagreement or minimize it. But, push comes to shove, these are not like elected officials. It's a hard job and it's not easy. And you're going to get people upset. And one of the things that you have to recognize in this job is you are forced to take positions you don't want to take, particularly if you're in the minority party. Part of the game is forcing people in charge will force the issues that will split you and divide you and force you to have to make compromises to minimize your level of support so that you can't win power back. This is not like, it is a cutthroat, full contact, brutal sport. And, some people turn around and say, my good friend from Massachusetts. You're like, you just stuck a knife in my back. And, you're grateful you count a friend from the guy is the person that stabs you in the front. Speaker Pelosi, literally, Speaker Pelosi once told me that the secret to counting votes is you count not the people that tell you yes, they're with you. It's the people that tell you no to your face. Because the people that tell you no to your face, are against you. But those are the folks you can count on. We would do caucus elections for various positions. And the number of times I was with somebody who said, I had, I needed 100 votes and I have 110 locked in. And I was friends with the opponent, and the other opponent says, I have 110 locked in. And you turn around and go, okay, well, there's 10 people on each side that are lying. Right? Like, people lie. And they lie in this business all the time. You don't want to disappoint you and they want to save face. So, it's a tough job, and ultimately you're going to make people upset, but you weren't elected to make everybody happy. You, at least in my mind, were elected to try to provide guidance and judgment and a vision for the people you serve. And if you believe in a diverse, multi-ethnic, inclusive community, there's going to be a lot of difference of opinions. You're going to make a lot of people upset by definition. And if you're doing that, but I can clearly communicate it and communicate what my value was and how I came to that decision and why I came to that decision, that's all you can ask of me. And it turns out if you can do that, how many people do you know that agree with you on 100% of everything? My wife doesn't agree with me on 100% of everything, right? Like, people let you go on that. It's like, okay, there's a reasonable, that the position you took is reasonable. I'm not going to vote against you because of that one. Some people might, but not everybody does. And if you don't have a reason, you haven't done your homework, then you're in trouble. But if you have, reasonable people can come down on a different side of a debate for reasonable reasons. And sometimes you just disagree. You can do that respectfully. That's the job. I got one more, and then I got to go to bed because I get it on an airplane tomorrow morning. I'm not coming to Maui, sadly, but that's wrong there, Mal.
One more question.
Presidential quote.
Hi, my name is Michael. I live on Oahu. I'm an advocate in the energy space. I wanted to follow up on something Addison mentioned earlier, which is that being such a heavily Democratic state, we're basically 100% Democrat. So what that leads to is being a Democrat, being the most politically expedient thing. And we now have a large portion of elected officials who in any other state would be Republican, Libertarian, something else. So, it's good in one sense, the party is inclusive and it has a wide umbrella, but on the other side, sometimes that means it's stretched so thin that the party loses its leverage or its meaning. So, there are trade-offs. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, if you've seen a similar situation in other jurisdictions, and if you were running a party in that kind of situation, what would you do?
First off, I wouldn't run a party. Second, listen, like I think like that's what primaries are for. Look, I believe that a Democratic Party should be big and bold and inclusive and welcome people in. I also believe in certain values that I'm not a Republican. And I believe in the values of the Democratic Party today. And so if people don't, then they have the ability to put a D or R or any other party affiliation next to their name. That's their choice. We then get to, it's up to the voters to decide whether that person is going to be best representative of their views and values in office or not. And if we think they're a fake Democrat, then somebody should primary them, right? And they get to make a decision. Now, I think that spectrum comes in from saying, hey, are you, do you happen to are you a Democrat a la Katie Porter in Orange County, California, right? Where Katie happens to be incredibly progressive, but uniquely capable as a representative, but in a very conservative district, are we going to be willing to tolerate members that are going to be a bit more conservative in order to win? Sure. But in more progressive districts, do we want somebody that's more solidly blue? Probably. But I also come back to saying, hey, if you have, as I articulated earlier, a vibrant and engaged and active political engagement community, their communities deserve to have somebody who is reflective of their values, vision, and political orientation. And so as much as I might say, listen, I want the most progressive person that can win, if that progressive person is winning because of an atrophy of political muscle, I still believe that there should be that political muscle exercised. And so this comes back to that continued systemic strategic engagement with our communities. And there are plenty of folks that win one election, as I said, crank up the barriers to entry and just rest on the laurels for the rest of their days. They gotta go, right? This isn't meant to be an easy job. It never has been, it never will be. It shouldn't be, right? It's public service. It's honorable. It's extremely, it requires enormous amount of sacrifice from the people that hold it, from their families. It is not an easy thing to do, but no one ever said it was. And it shouldn't be if you're trying to get work 35 hours a week and get a pension after 50 years, go into something else. Don't do this. And if people are comfortable, primary them. Again, no complaint from me, right? They don't always work, but you know what? You have a strong primary challenge to somebody that hasn't been challenged in a while. You're gonna, even if that person wins, the incumbent wins, you're going to see that incumbent be far more responsive, far more present, far more reactive, far more diligent and connected to their community than they ever have been before, because they know they gotta be, and they know they weren't. And that's not a bad thing.
Great, thank you, Joel. If you just hang on for 1 second, Hokulani has something to say for closing remarks.
Sorry to keep you and make sure you don't miss your flight. Just wanted to say mahalo nui loa, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us here this evening, sharing your knowledge and your experience with our inaugural Partners for Democracy cohort. My name is Hokulani Jonathan, and I'm an advocate from Hawai'i Island. I currently serve as a senior policy advisor to Congressman Kylie Kahele through a fellowship with the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement. And I get the honor and privilege of doing so in my hometown of Hilo, working out of our district office. I joined this program to learn more about civic engagement, advocacy, and campaign management with the intention of gaining the skills necessary to serve as an effective advocate for my community. And as I reflect over the course of this very successful program, I am grateful for all of those who worked hard to put this together. Our cohort has members from across the state of Hawaii, and each of the different islands bring their own unique personalities and perspectives. And in honor of this, we would like to present to you and send you a care package with some specially curated gifts from each of our relative communities. Let me just preview for you here. So thank you so much again for spending this time with us here this evening. And your words and your work are super inspiring and eye-opening to us all. So let's give one more round of applause.
Thanks so much, everybody. Honored to be with you, and I can't wait to see what you're gonna do. So good luck.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Take care.
I know.